Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Lee Borton's Tim Knotts and I discuss a book each week from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum with you. This is a book club for lovers of the word made flesh. It is a Wednesday, August 23rd, and today we're also joined by CCMM curriculum developer Stephanie Meter. So, Stephanie, tell us about our shows for this month.
So this month we're talking about British literature, and we've already talked about Beowulf, Pilgrim's Progress, and Father Brown. Today we talk about Pride and Prejudice, and next week we'll wrap up British literature with Mere Christianity.
Thanks. I might have told my students this week that I would read 100 classics of British literature for every one of American literature, but that also might be tipping my hand a little bit. So you listeners can access all of our past episodes on Lee's YouTube channel at Lee Bortons or at her website in the archives at leebortons.com. So Stephanie's going to kick us off today.
Well, Jennifer, I would like you to tell us why this book is in the CC catalog.
So one of the things that we've tried to do in curating our curriculum is pick some really great classic literature. And for the most part, we've tried to pick things that are uplifting. So it's hard to do a good survey of British literature without having a book by Jane Austen. And this is one of my favorite of hers, although Emma's a close second. So we really wanted to give students an opportunity to discuss Austen's style, particularly. She's been called the Shakespeare of the novel because she reveals her characters so often through their own speeches, the way you would get to know characters in a play. And she's early on in the novel. And so that's one of the reasons perhaps that she does that. It's much more like a drama. So often they're revealed through their letters or their speeches. And so it's at the sort of beginning of the era of the classic British novels. But this one also gives us a chance to meet some young people who are not much older than our own students in classical conversations, who are making their way in the world and usually meeting their spouses. And so we get to talk about courtship and the right way to propose to someone and the very wrong way to propose to someone. So it's a fun book for our students. Lots of humor in this one. So Stephanie, now that I've given us a little peek into Austen, her name does always come up when we talk about classic authors. So why don't you tell us a little bit about who she is?
Sure. So as you mentioned, she was a novelist when the novel was on the rise. She was one of 8 children, and so she grew up surrounded by humor and human nature, and she would actually write stories and read them to her family around the fire in the evenings, which is just lovely. So growing up with her family like that, I think enabled her to fill her stories with all kinds of truths about relationships and society as a whole. At this time, ladies and careers didn't mix as much as they do now, but Austen wrote really well and wisely, and she actually won a years-long copyright battle for what would eventually be Northanger Abbey. She never married. She was in love at least once and was proposed to, and she accepted, but then the next day had changed her mind. So we see a little bit about that insistence on staying true to oneself in Pride and Prejudice.
Yes, and her story is a little bit like one of my other favorite authors, which is Louisa May Alcott, who also had lots of siblings and read her stories to them and also remained unmarried. So, all right. So we talked a little bit about some of the characters that we would meet in this one. There's quite a large cast of characters in Pride and Prejudice. It's a big ensemble cast. So if you've seen like the BBC miniseries or you've read the book, you meet quite a few people. So Tim, do you want to tell us about our primary families in here?
Sure, yeah. So this novel, like most of the Jane Austen novels, occur in a fictional setting, sort of a county area in England. In this case, just supposedly north of London. And there's 2 families that are sort of the center of the action, and that's the Bennet family and the Bingley family. So the Bennet family is made up of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet and their 5 daughters. Their 5 daughters, Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Catherine or Kitty, and Lydia. And Mr. Bennet is the inheritor of an estate, but it's not a very big estate. It still puts them sort of in that upper class, but they're in the lower tier of the upper class. And unfortunately for the 5 daughters, the estate is entailed, which is a a thing that was occurring a lot in England during those days to protect the family inheritance generation to generation so that it wouldn't be given to a daughter and then married away into another family. And so Mr. Bennet possesses the estate but isn't able to pass it on to any one of his 5 daughters. Instead, it's going to be passed on to a distant cousin of his, Mr. Collins, should there be no male heirs. Mrs. Bennet is extremely concerned with her daughters' futures and is very interested in getting them all settled with eligible young men, preferably ones with a lot of money. And let's see, the 5 daughters are, again, Jane, who is a very compliant and proper young woman who's attractive, and all the young men are interested in her for her character primarily. Elizabeth, who is really our main female protagonist in the story, who is beautiful but also pretty headstrong, and she kind of takes after her dad in the fact that she's very sarcastic. A lot of modern readers really enjoy her for her veiled humor. Mary the third is bookish and very awkward. Kitty and Lydia are the youngest and are both foolish and impetuous and very fickle and concerned with social engagements and their futures with young men who are attractive and wealthy. The Bingley family is made up of a brother and 2 sisters. The brother is Charles, who has inherited his parents' estate. They live in Netherfield Park. He is much wealthier than the Bennet family. He has an income of $5,000 a year, and his 2 sisters, Caroline and Louisa is married. Her name is Hurst by marriage. Are both extremely proud young women, and even though their father was a man of business and had earned his money, and so they weren't really from sort of the generational landed aristocracy, they have a very high view of their social position and disapprove greatly of Charles's interest in Jane Bennet, who eventually, spoiler alert, he marries.
I know we always have to have these spoiler alerts. So one of my favorite characters over the years has always been Mr. Bennet. But interestingly, when you're at a CC meeting, we got into a long conversation about whether his, his biting, sarcastic comments would make for a good father in real life, or if it's only funny when you're reading about it in a book. It might be a different story if you had to live with him, but he does get in some pretty good zingers. One of my favorites is when his Mrs. Bennet is complaining about her nerves, and he says something like, "They have been my companions lo these many years." So that's a great scene. Very good. I like how you pointed out that everyone is sort of introduced by how much money they make. So we left off someone who has an income even larger than Mr. Bingley's. So does anyone want to tell us about him? You want to go for that, Stephanie?
Sure. Our other main character is Mr. Darcy. He does make more than all of the other people, but he's a little socially awkward. He is shy, and it comes off as him seeming, or maybe really being, prideful and arrogant, and quick to judge people. So he's not a bad guy, but Elizabeth doesn't like him very much right away. He's very rich, and not a lot of fun at parties.
Yes. So we've kind of set up the plot a little bit. So poor Mr. Bennet has this very large family of daughters. His estate has to be inherited by his male heir, Mr. Collins, and so they've got to provide for these girls. And Mrs. Bennet sets out about that very early in the novel by trying to get her husband to go over and meet Bingley the moment he moves to the neighborhood, so that he can immediately become a prospect for one of the girls, since she knows about his income. So tell us a little bit more. What else happens during this story that seems significant to you guys?
Yeah, I was thinking about a plot summary, and when you tried to summarize the plot, it doesn't sound like a whole lot happens. It's not a boring book at all, but it's very, very character driven. And so a lot of what Elizabeth does is have conversations and attend parties. She travels with her aunt and uncle a little bit. Um, there's some excitement with her younger sister Lydia running away with someone. Yeah, Tim, do you want to say anything about the plot as well?
Yeah, the male heir, Mr. Collins, is quite the character also. He's a clergyman and has taken a position with Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who he has the greatest esteem for and ceaselessly talks about no matter where he goes and where and to whom he's speaking. Um, he also has an interest in Elizabeth and pursues her for a while, but she really can't stand him and sort of spurns him, and he leaves in a huff after sort of repeatedly sticking his foot in his mouth, both with Elizabeth and other people in the community. So he's a little bit of the comedic element in the story to some degree. So I've always enjoyed him. And as Jennifer alluded to earlier, there are quite a few marriage proposals in this book, and Mr. Collins's marriage proposal is one of the ones that young people should read to learn how not to propose to their future spouse.
Yes,
Also, slight spoiler, Mr. Darcy's first proposal is also not something to emulate. So we got a couple of different bad options.
yes. So I have to go to Mr. Collins' proposal for a minute because he basically gives Elizabeth a persuasive speech. And my students went through one year and outlined his proofs, and he actually enumerates them as if is actually giving a persuasive speech. So he says, first, I think it's a right thing for every clergyman to set the example of matrimony in his parish. So not a typical proposal we would think of today, not I'm madly in love with you, I want to spend my life with you, but I think it's a good idea for me to set an example. And then he says, secondly, I'm convinced it will add very greatly to my happiness. I don't guess he cares about Lizzie's happiness. And then thirdly, which perhaps I ought to have mentioned earlier, that it is the particular advice and recommendation of the very noble lady whom I have the honor of calling patroness. So even in his proposal, he cannot help bragging about his relationship with Lady Catherine de Bourgh. This is not a proposal designed to win a young lady's heart.
No, and actually, frankly, reminds me a lot of the proposal of St. John from Jane Eyre, which is one of the great British novels that we're not talking about this month, but is in our catalog. So if you want to learn some more about bad marriage proposals, that would be another great place to go.
Yes, they usually should not sound like a job offer, which that one in Jane Eyre very much does. Oh, so good. So we have all these couples getting together. So again, spoiler alert, but Stephanie, do all 5 of the girls get married? What happens?
No. So do you want me to talk about who does?
Yes. Why don't you talk about our couples?
So Jane and Mr. Bingley do end up together. Lizzie and Mr. Darcy end up together. Lydia and Mr. Wickham of the militia end up together. And Mary and Kitty are unwed as of the end of the story.
Yes, which is not quite surprising on Mary's part, since she tends to bore everyone to death by playing the piano just a little too long, or other of her showing off of her talent. So we didn't talk about Mr. Wickham yet. So let's talk about who Lydia ends up with. Who wants to talk about Mr. Wickham?
Tim, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So Mr. Wickham is a young and dashing soldier who is acquaintances with several of the people in town. And sort of despite some significant red flags, he attracts the attention of several of the young ladies. And sadly, you see, I don't know, should I tell which of this is? I guess you already did.
Oh, yes. Yeah, you can.
So Kitty right? It's Kitty.
It's Lydia. Yeah.
Lydia. I always get the two confused. They're so
Well,
much
yeah,
alike
they're
in so
very
many
similar.
ways.
They're so
Lydia,
similar and so close in
right.
age.
Mhm.
Lydia ends up eloping with him, running off, and it's only through the good auspices of Mr. Darcy, sort of behind the scenes, working at things out, that they are found and end up getting settled together, and actually being properly married and set up together. But uh, nonetheless, Lydia breezes in home to crow over her superior married status to her sisters as soon as she's able to come back to town. And it's quite the scene.
Yes, and she's very, very young, which is one of the reasons she's so foolish. Is she like 15 or 16 when
Yeah, I
they
think she's
elope?
15 in the story. Yeah.
Very young. So this is one of the plot points that my students sometimes have a hard time understanding. So why is it so scandalous that Wickham and Lydia run away together, and why is the whole rest of the family so concerned about this?
Well, if Lydia runs off with a man and in sort of a scandalous way, it's going to tarnish the reputation of all of the other daughters and make it harder for any of them to get married. So just running off with a guy is bad enough just on her own, but the reputation that she's kind of, spreading around for the rest of her family can be really damaging for them.
Yeah, it is all about money in a sense, right? They talk about money a lot, but there's also the word connections that gets thrown around in all of
Mhm.
Jane Austen's novels, because it's not just about how much you make, but it's about what potential future you have for advancement. And so, the Bingley sisters look down on the Bennets, not only because they don't have a great estate that makes them a lot of money, but also because they just don't have a lot of high-powered family connections.
Yeah.
And so with Lydia running off, the sisters' prospects of having improved connections through one of the sisters marrying up in the world has just been diminished, because she's instead married some landless militia officer and done it in a pretty socially unacceptable way.
Yes. Yeah, and so as you mentioned, it is all about connections as well as class and money. And horror of horrors, some of the Bennett's relations are actually in trade. They have to work for a living, and this is one of the reasons that the Bingley sisters can look down on them. And then the other is just it is about the company that you keep. And so one of the interesting paradoxes in the book is that Mrs. Bennet is so very concerned about getting all the girls married off, but that causes her to make some really bad decisions about supervising those two youngest ones. And she allows them to keep some very bad company and to run off after the companies of officers and behave in ways that well-bred young ladies who want to be in the upper class ought not to behave. So well, I know this is one of the questions that you were particularly interested in, Stephanie. So we've said that, and we've just talked about a huge number of characters, huge cast. And so the themes that are in the books usually revolve around those characters. So what kinds of character related themes did you guys see Austen exploring in Pride and Prejudice? You want to start, Steph?
Sure. Yeah. One of the ones that I think comes up a lot in Pride and Prejudice and also in Emma, which is my second favorite Austen as well. Maybe my first, not sure. But just the idea of seeming rather than being. And so there's a lot of seeming or appearing or being gentleman-like in the book, which I think is really interesting, between gentleman-like and gentleman. And so if you just keep an eye throughout the whole book of who seems a certain way versus who is a certain way, some characters seem like bad guys, some seem like good guys, and then but what are they? Not just what do they seem. So that's one of the big character-related themes that I think is fascinating to look at in this story.
Yes, and particularly with Mr. Wickham, it takes us a while to figure out who he is versus who he seems to be. He seems to be this very amiable, pleasant companion, and then we find out that he's kind of a shady guy. This is not the first time he's tried to corrupt a young lady. So how about you, Tim? What kinds of themes did you pick up on?
Yeah, I think that idea of improvement by moving up the social ladder or the financial ladder, and that being a sort of overwhelming driving force for a lot of people, that is what they're motivated by. Mr. Collins is all about his somewhat tenuous relationship, but one that he harps on all the time about his patroness, and the girls are always talking about how much income some guy has, and it's not about whether he's a good man, it's just about how much he's got. But Austen sort of pulls back the curtain a little bit on that, and she does explore with some of her main characters and uses others as a foil for that sort of perspective to show that a happy match and one that improves the person is not always the one that is the financial or the social improvement.
Yeah. So who do you guys think is the hero of the story?
Man, we'd have to define hero first. I mean, I don't know if I'm gonna go first. I think Mr. Darcy has to be the hero. He's the one who does the things. Elizabeth is the heroine and that she's the main character. But she doesn't swoop in to save the day really at any point, and Mr. Darcy does in a couple of places.
Yeah. Which partly I think is because he has the ability to. He has much more of an opportunity to help people than she does, given her position and the fact that she's a woman in this society. He has money and influence and knowledge that enable him to, save the day with her sister. How about you, Tim?
Yeah, I think the other thing is that when he does what he does to sort of rectify the situation with Wickham and Lydia, he does it not just sort of quietly, but he actually insists on the people who know about what he's doing to keep silence about it and not tell the Bennet family that he is the benefactor. And only eventually does it come out, and not because of his choices. And so in that sense there, I think too that he's very much the hero in that sense. I also really do like Bingley. He's a good man. I wouldn't call him a hero, but he is one of um the defender of what is good, right? In other men, he'll stand up for what's right and good and not allow things that are ungentlemanly to go by uncommented on.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you get the sense that all his life he will be a good friend, a good father, a good husband, and that Jane will be a good wife, and that they will have good children. They are specially fit, maybe not to be sharp-witted, but to be very kind and to be a good supporting characters, good friends, good at their roles. So,
and Bingley does stand up to his two sisters.
That's true.
Who henpeck him pretty badly at times.
Yes. Yes, they're quite aggressive. So let's talk a little bit about the title and this idea of character-driven themes. So who is proud and who is prejudiced, and does it change?
Well, I think we're initially supposed to think that Elizabeth is prejudiced and Darcy is proud, and I think that is primarily the case, but I think both of them are both of them a little bit.
Yeah, it is interesting though, I think, to Tim's point about how Darcy does not want his actions known, that he's not arrogant.
And there's that line about vanity being different. I think maybe it's even Mary who says it, but she says that vanity is what it's either pride or vanity, but one of them is what you think of yourself, and the other one is what other people think about you, or something like that.
Yeah. Austen's very good at that kind of wordplay, rotating on definitions and pairs of contrasts. So this isn't her only book with the title like this. We have Sense and Sensibility. But what about you, Tim? What do you think about the title?
Yeah, I think she plays on it a lot. And again, that idea Stephanie brought up of appearances versus reality, where Darcy appears to be very proud and in reality is just awkward and somewhat reclusive. one of the scenes that's the most prideful or the most pride on display is actually when Lady Catherine de Bourgh comes to sort of rebuke Elizabeth for any perceived interest she might have in Darcy, because there's a connection there as well. And uh, in a sense, that may be actually the thing that drives Elizabeth to Darcy is that she comes to say, you should have nothing to do with him. And Elizabeth sort of throws it back in her teeth, not saying that she has an interest, but that if she were to have an interest, it's no skin off Lady de Bourgh's nose in the first place, and that she should have no worries about that. And so you have that the great towering pride of the lady, right? The titled rich heiress, to contrast in some ways against I think Mrs. Bennet, right, who has a pride of her daughters, of her in her own sort of way. She thinks they're all a catch. She thinks they're all worthy of the greatest gentleman, despite the fact that really they're a mixed bag.
Yeah. And I like that you brought that scene up with Lady Catherine and Elizabeth, because definitely in that scene, Elizabeth's pride is wounded. And it is one of the things I think that spurs her toward Mr. Darcy. There's nothing like telling young people they shouldn't marry for making them want to marry. So that scene definitely pushed the plot along a little bit, I think.
It's a very Shakespearean scene in a lot
It
of
is.
ways.
It is, yes. And like Shakespearean plays, yeah, anytime there's a large family, usually the older siblings do well, and it's a little harder for the ones down the line. So this is maybe a little gentler than a Shakespeare play where the younger brother is usually the villain. I wouldn't say that Lydia and Kitty are villains, but they're definitely foolish and they do not turn out as well as their older siblings. So yeah, it's very Shakespearean novel all the way around. Well, it is time for our ad. So I will thank our sponsor, classicalconversationsbooks.com, where all the books we're discussing can be purchased. The entire calendar of our Words Aptly Spoken book clubs is at leebortons.com, with links to purchase the books at the CC book site if you want to read along with us. And next week, we are going to discuss Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, which will be quite a switch from Pride and Prejudice. So if you want to get that book and read along with us, you certainly can grab it there and join us next time. All right, so now is the time in the discussion usually where we look and have a close reading of the text itself. And so Stephanie, I think you have our first passage for us, which is a very famous line. I have it on a coffee mug. Many people have it on t-shirts. Some of my students have strong reactions to it. So we'll let you take it away, Stephanie.
All right, this is page 1, the very first line of the book. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife.
All right, what do you guys think about this? How's this for an opener?
I love it, partly because I mean, again, just to go back to the fact that this is, in a sense, a very Shakespearean moment. This book, the story, these characters, and Shakespeare does nothing if not speak to humanity, right? The human story, the way that things just seem to always go. Maybe overemphasized or caricatured a bit here and there to make a point, but they're very human stories. And so I think she does a great job with this first line of sort of giving that broad brush of this is going to be a story about a particular group of people, but it's also going to speak to some of these universal truths that, while this one may or may not be true, the story's truths are.
Yeah, how about you, Steph?
Yeah, I think this is just genius. She does so much in this one sentence because she gives us kind of the plot of the whole book. We know it's going to be about men may be in want of a wife, or maybe people just want them to be in want of a wife. The broad universal truth statement. And just like the fact that the sentence is kind of funny brings some sarcasm and some irony into this. And so we get a little taste of Austen's style, that she may be about to mock some social conventions, but as Tim said, also drop truth about the truth of them and the way the world kind of works. So, we get the irony and the sarcasm and the plot in this one fun sentence.
Yeah, I think that's true. Both of those things are there. And it's interesting because one year I had a young man in my community when I was tutoring Challenge 2, which is where we read this book in CC's programs. And he came to community and said, I think I'm in trouble here because I read the first sentence of this book and I'm pretty sure it's not a book for me. He didn't find anything there that he particularly wanted to read about. In his mind, he decided it was a girl book. And interestingly, he has since read it several times and it became one of his favorites. And he was the most vocal during our class discussions. So I thought it was interesting that the opening sentence did its job of being extremely provocative. So what do you guys think about, you mentioned Austen's sarcasm, Stephanie. What do you think about her sarcasm? Is it mean and biting? Is it gentle? What do you guys think about her style?
I don't know if I would ever describe sarcasm as gentle, but I mean, it's fairly biting. It's never mean or mean-spirited. But a lot of the characters have a very dry sense of humor, especially Mr. Bennet and Elizabeth. And their sarcasm is often really insightful. It kind of gets right through the appearances to the heart of the matter in a way that is disarming and funny, and might make you chuckle and make some of the characters a little uncomfortable with the fact that Elizabeth has seen through their armor. So it doesn't ever feel mean, although Mr. Bennet's sarcasm is definitely inconvenient for his family, and he's not actually a great head of the family. His sarcasm is more, I think, for us and for Elizabeth a little bit.
Yeah. How about you, Tim? What do you think about Austen's style here in our sentence one?
Yeah, I agree. I think what's lovely about it is that she exercises it judiciously, and she always, where she has biting sarcasm, it's always aimed at something that deserves being punctured, right? It's often aimed at pride or these sort of meaningless social conventions that don't have anything to do with true value, but are just empty conventions. She's very good at that. And never using it against things that are good, right? She doesn't go after virtues with her sarcasm. It's always after some kind of vice.
Yeah, and they're not always, but there are often flaws that aren't major. So I always get the sense when I'm reading her that she does see the strengths and weaknesses of everyone, and she sees the humor in people's weaknesses. But there's definitely not this malicious idea with her. She clearly loves people and loves to get to know them and do these character sketches of them. So, okay, well, we mentioned this already, but Elizabeth starts off not particularly liking Mr. Darcy. In fact, she likes Mr. Wickham, which is an opinion that has to change. But by the time we get to our next quotation, she has started to see Mr. Darcy's, she started to have a different opinion of his character. So Tim, you want to read this one?
Sure. This is significantly later in the book because it takes quite a while for these characters and social settings to develop. So this is all the way out at page 301. Elizabeth began now to comprehend that he was exactly the man who, in disposition and talents, would most suit her. His understanding and temper, though unlike her own, would have answered all her wishes. It was a union that must have been to the advantage of both. By her ease and liveliness, his mind might have been softened, his manners improved, and from his judgment, information, and knowledge of the world, she must have received benefit of greater importance.
What do you think of this one, Stephanie?
I like her starting to think about the way that two different personalities can complement each other. Realizing that because Mr. Darcy is so different from her, it doesn't necessarily mean that they would be ill-matched, but it might actually balance them a little bit. His understanding and temper and then her kind of liveliness can maybe lighten him up a little bit, help him to be more socially fluent. But then also the union socially is, I mean, she's not a social climber, but it is something interesting for her. Like he has the actual social connections, but she has the interpersonal ease. So putting them together, I think, would benefit them both a lot. And she starts to realize that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting here that at the end she says from his judgment, information, and knowledge of the world. That's one thing she definitely does not have. She has, it's very difficult for, first of all, she's young, so she doesn't have a lot of experience of the world. And secondly, she's been confined to a very narrow social circle around her home, which would have been very common. And his world will open up wider, people to know, more books to read, travel. And so she does see that, she begins to see that perhaps her judgment wasn't based on a lot of experience, and you almost feel her reluctance to change her opinion, but she's getting there. So how about you, Tim? What do you think as you were reading it?
Yeah, a couple things. Number one, there's nothing in here about money or the nice house that he lives in. Those are not concerns for her. Um, And in a sense, even here, it says, and from his judgment, right? She had earlier on in the novel, if anything that she questioned about him, it was his judgment, right? That he had poor judgment of people, poor judgment of himself. And now she's looking at him and thinking, wow, he's a really discerning guy. He doesn't get taken in by appearances. I could learn from that. He would benefit me by helping me to see things with those eyes. And again, I think that word advantage in this paragraph is an important one that that is talked about a lot in a lot of Austen's writings, right? That people are always looking for what's going to be of advantage to them in these connections or these marriages or these financial situations. And here her estimation of what is really of advantage has changed very much and is now about their characters, their personalities being compatible, and that is the advantage that she's looking for.
Yeah, and you can see if you're at all thinking back to her first proposal from Mr. Collins, that they would have been disastrously disadvantageous to one another. There is no way in which their characters would have improved one another or that they could have had a happy marriage. And so she's definitely gained some experience, partly through seeing Mr. Darcy in different circumstances and partly through her sister's disastrous mistakes. She is starting to see what a real happy marriage might look like. And she certainly does not see that in her own parents. They're not particularly well suited for one another. So she's had to learn about this a different way. So, all right, we have one more quotation. So Stephanie, do you want to read us this one?
Sure. Yeah, so this comes from Darcy and Elizabeth's conversation after they kind of finally understand each other a lot more at the end. And this is something Darcy says to Elizabeth. I have been a selfish being all my life, in practice, though not in principle. As a child, I was taught what was right, but I was not taught to correct my temper. I was only given good principles, but left to follow them in pride and conceit. Unfortunately, an only son, for many years an only child, I was spoiled by my parents, who, though good themselves, my father particularly, all that was benevolent and amiable, allowed, encouraged, almost taught me to be selfish and overbearing, to care for none beyond my own family circle, to think meanly of all the rest of the world, to wish at least to think meanly of their sense and worth compared with my own. Such I was from 8 to 28, and such I might still have been, but for you, dearest, loveliest Elizabeth. What do I not owe you? You taught me a lesson, hard indeed at first, but most advantageous. By you I was properly humbled. I came to you without a doubt of my reception. You showed me how insufficient were all my pretensions to please a woman worthy of being pleased.
Yeah, I mean, she definitely brings him down a bit off his pedestal, doesn't she? Everyone thinks he's a catch. He has a lot of money and he has good social standing, and then she's not swayed by those things when she first meets him. So it's probably the first time that someone has not just been fawning all over him. What were you thinking about, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, again, you see this. This is one of those themes in like all the romantic movies and books about a prideful man that at some point falls in love with a woman, and you hear him say something along the lines of this, right? Like, you make me want to be a better man. That's in essence what he's said here. Um and again, an interesting comparison, if you want to read another book to compare with this one, would be to go and read the Taming of the Shrew, and see how some of those relationships in that Shakespearean play compare to what's gone on here about who's taming who, and how is that working out for them, and what are the appearances versus what are the realities. You know, it's good to see Darcy sort of bearing his real heart to her and telling her, not just sweeping under the rug what he had been, but sort of admitting it and still claiming, you know, that he still kind of needs her to do this and do it well, you know, to be a more humble and compassionate man.
Yeah. What leapt out at you as you were reading, Stephanie?
Yeah, I mean, this quote is all about Darcy realizing what he has to learn from Elizabeth, and that's really beautiful. We also hear in other places what Elizabeth has to learn from Darcy. So yeah, I mean, this is they sort of both start thinking this way at the end. And so here we saw Darcy going through all of that out loud in his mind, but just that willingness of both parties to change and acknowledge where they were wrong and where they can grow from each other. The last couple of chapters of this book I just find so beautiful. I don't remember if this is the last chapter or the chapter before the last one, but those last two, we just see them working together as a unit in a way that's so beautiful. We see Darcy make an effort with Elizabeth's crazy family. He's trying, he's listening, he's being kind. And then we also see Elizabeth sort of watching him interact with her family and being ready to swoop in and save him when it becomes too much. So like, he's willing to put in all this effort. She's willing to kind of guard him. It's just really cool to see two such different people come together and be on the same page and admit both of their faults and grow and learn from each other. Just love it.
Yeah. And one of the things I particularly admire about Darcy by the end is, well, there's two. I always do that. I always say I'm going to say one thing and then I say two. So I'll cheat and say two. Again, I'm in character, speaking of character. So one thing is just the way he cares for his sister Georgiana. Sometimes when you're young, you might not think that that's a good way to measure a man's character. But the fact that he is so protective of his much younger sister makes him worthy of Elizabeth's attention. And then the second thing is just this immense responsibility that he takes for allowing Wickham to elope with Lydia, which seems so strange. And I find my students really think that's a reach for him to take responsibility for Wickham. But in Darcy's estimation of himself, he should have warned people about Wickham. And so because he did not do that, and then Wickham harms Lydia, and Darcy feels he could have prevented it. And that's one of the reasons that he swoops in to take care of the situation. I just really admire that level of responsibility and accountability in a man, especially when we look around, and a lot of times our society is driven by avoiding blame and responsibility. So what did you got? Any thoughts from you guys?
Yeah, it's like the opposite of the "Am I my brother's keeper?" Right? We don't look at it and say he was responsible, but he felt that burden and responsibility in a way that is completely opposite of the avoiding responsibility, like you said, Jennifer. I'd see those even biblical implications there.
Yeah. And just that, I mean, we've talked a lot and been trying to reclaim the idea of community for the last, several decades now in classical conversations. And this novel is all about those, your obligations to your community, your family, and then your extended family, and then all of the community. So, well, Stephanie, I know this is one of your all-time favorite books. So do you have any last closing thought before we wind this up today?
No, I mean, just read it and just enjoy the characters. Yeah, I think this is a fun book to share with people too. So if you were reading it, and if for some reason you're somehow reading it by yourself, I would do everything you can to convince one of your friends to read it with you so that you can talk about this and laugh together. This is such a good bonding book, I think.
It is. And some scenes are just crying to be read aloud. So, all right. Well, you guys, I really enjoyed our discussion today. And listeners, we just appreciate you listening. And we hope that you will keep reading and keep the conversations going and grab a copy of Pride and Prejudice and read it with a friend. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.